Hey folks, Alex Wiseman here. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about education funding or funding and policy more specifically. And so we're going to take a few minutes to go through a couple things. Apparently there's a timer on this, so it just went from one slide to the other. There are a couple of political cartoons that I have here at the beginning that I wanted to just show you that sort of express the frustration I think that a lot of educators and the general public feels about funding for education. And given the importance that we've been giving to um, uh, the different stakeholder perspectives about education and funding, this is a really important thing to consider. And so when we think about how funding and how privatization, which is a more recent trend related to funding, not just for education, but also for a lot of other institutions, how those two juxtapose with one another, and we see that reflected in these political cartoons, we can kind of get a little bit of the sense of frustration or futility sometimes that I think people feel around education and funding or any um, uh, sort of core institutional function or social function like education or healthcare or something else, and how funding and funding policies work related to that. So we can see with the sort of burned out light bulb that the idea is that there's never enough funding for whatever it is that we're talking about. And that there's this constant sort of struggle that we need the funding in order to have some basic provision of needs and be able to conduct the business of the day, whether that's teaching and learning, whether that's something related to another industry, it doesn't matter. In this cartoon, you've got the idea that business is involved in some of this decision making. So business supports the privatization of public education. Because when we look at the youth of America, and you see the dollar sign appear where the kid's head is, we see potential yet to be developed. So there is this, whether you're, doesn't matter where your political leanings lie when you look at this, because I think it's a little bit more about how different industries interact with one another rather than it is about politics. But those both play into the policy considerations. One of those that has come up very frequently and is being paid attention to again right now is this idea that there are other institutions that are provided funding when education in particular should be receiving more funding, or at least the argument is it should be receiving more funding. So this simply shows that if prisons are where the funding is, then let's look like a prison. And it's a silly cartoon, right? But it also gives us this idea that it shifts our priorities. Where the money goes is where the interest goes, where the agenda goes, where our thinking goes. And so it will change the way that we implement whatever it is that we're implementing. And then this one simply shows that there's often a pretty tight maze to get the funding or to use the funding. Sometimes the funding is there, but you have to meet certain conditions in order to actually be able to access it and spend it. Or it's restricted in terms of what it can be spent on. That is something that happens frequently in every institution, not just education. So we have a couple of challenges when we think of policy and funding or the money side of things. And as you probably heard from me before, a very important component to thinking of policy to practice is the infrastructure component. And infrastructure is facilities, it's personnel, and then probably most importantly, it's resources, meaning money or funding. So thinking about what that money or funding looks like and what already exists versus what we'll need in the future, or what we have access to versus what we don't have access to, what is fixed in terms of infrastructure, what is flexible or what is renewable. Those are going to be all important questions to ask that are often driven by a policy. So there are a couple of things that we can talk about related to funding. I wanted to start us a little bit with some thinking about funding. And I'm going to make this specific to education, but again, I want to make the argument that this is applicable to just about any sort of organization or institution that receives some level of public money. Now, we're going to talk very specifically about some of the intricacies of funding education in the K through 12 system and the K through 12 public system in particular. But there are some broader tenets that we can take away and apply across the board, whether we're talking about a nonprofit organization, or we're talking about a healthcare organization, or we're talking even a for-profit organization or an NGO or any of those types of things. So do school resources matter is a really key question. And the answer is typically yes. And if you are familiar with the readings around funding that I've asked you to look at, you'll know that everyone in the readings anyway says that yes, school resources do matter, and they're especially important. I mean, you can look at just the difference between let's say a historic building in terms of infrastructure, just the physical facilities, and something that, well, this is probably new in the 80s or 90s, but something that's a little newer or has more consistency in terms of heating and cooling, in terms of the types of resources that are available in that infrastructure. Is there a space big enough for whatever it is that needs to happen? Are there indoor facilities versus outdoor facilities? Is there, it also is more than just about the tangible. So the kind of expectations that you might get from students, teachers, and the community, parents included, when you have a school or you have an institution that has a building that looks like this, and it's hard to tell probably on this screen, but it's a little run down. There is some trash on the ground in front of it. It actually looks like the kind of school that I went to in middle school. And then you have this one, which is, well-maintained lawn. It's clean. It's new in some era. It's well-maintained. The expectations that you have about education are going to be very much playing off of the resources that are available, the infrastructure that is available. So we get a typical complaint, especially from administrators in high poverty areas, that they have difficulty developing long-term plans for schools because they can't predict the availability of resources. And the question that I'll just, I guess, rhetorically pose to you is, why can't they? Why can't they predict their long-term plans? Well, there are a lot of things, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why, especially in higher poverty areas, that there are more difficulties in developing long-term plans for schools around resources. But one of the key things, and maybe you thought of this while I was talking just now, one of the key things is that there is sometimes a changing formula for how educational funds are delivered or made available. For example, in Texas, this is Texas in 2020, in the legislature last year, there was House Bill 3 that was passed, which made some significant updates to our funding legislation for education in the state of Texas. There are also changes in terms of the restrictions or the availability of funds from the federal level. And so it's sometimes hard to predict how much federal funding will be coming or in what form it will be coming to use. There are often more standards or restrictions or requirements placed on money that goes to high poverty areas because it's usually for specific programs than there are on monies that go to well-funded areas. And also because, at least in the United States and in most of the places where you guys are living, there's a significant portion of the funding for education that comes from the local community's property taxes. And in high poverty or low income areas, those property taxes are rather low. And so the revenue that's going to go into education from those areas, at least from the local sources, is going to be low. So it's difficult to plan if you don't have a very stable understanding of what your budget looks like. And there are often crises that will affect this. So many of you are a little younger than I am, but some of you are old enough to remember the impact that 9/11 had, not just in the areas around New York City, but across the country in terms of economic repercussions and lower levels of funding coming from taxes and other state or federal supported organizations. We are in the midst of a pandemic at the moment that has severely affected the ability of those entities that fund education, at least at the public level, to regularly generate revenue. And so there's a lower level of potential funding that is coming from state and federal sources, simply because there's a lower level of inputs, a lower level of revenue that they're receiving. The question then is, do school resources make a difference? And the answer from most corners is yes. Yes, it does make a difference. The more resources that are available, then the more opportunity that people have to do whatever it is they need to do in the schools, and the better the attitude and expectations are of the teachers, the students, the parents, the community around education. What's interesting about this is that there's a difference in terms of school resources and resources that come from the community. And so it's really important to understand this balance between funding for education that is strictly tied to the education system itself, and funding for education, or I should say it differently, and funding or infrastructure that exists in the broader community. One of the reasons why we know this is such an important distinction is because of the work of the man on the screen right now, James Coleman, who unfortunately passed away many years ago. But the Coleman Report, as it's typically called, it's the Equality of Educational Opportunity Report, was commissioned by President Lyndon B. Johnson, which those of you in Texas will probably be even more aware of, way back in 1966. Actually, in 1965, it was published in 1966. And many people, I think myself included, would argue that this is arguably one of the most important education studies of the 20th century, because it showed us things about resources and background related to education that we just didn't know before that. So the report was written by the sociologist James Coleman. At the time, he was at Johns Hopkins University, I think. And what they found was, and by the way, I should say a couple of things about this that are kind of nerdy, but not really related to the funding issue. But anyway, they're interesting. This report that he wrote was one of the first federally contracted reports of its kind. So the president's task force, you might remember in the mid-60s, there was the civil rights conundrum. That's a very tame and lame way to say that, but there was a lot of struggle over civil rights, and Lyndon Johnson was trying to basically be able to use evidence to show that schools that were poorly funded, especially those in predominantly African-American communities, led to lower achievement, so that he could make an argument for providing more funding for those schools without it necessarily being a racial issue and being more of a funding issue. And so what he asked Coleman to do, or what Coleman was contracted to do, was to do a study on resources that went into education and the effects that those had on student achievement or student learning outcomes. So performance indicators of many kinds, achievement being one of those. What's interesting about that from a nerdy perspective is that this was one of the first studies that was really in the history of American educational research that was trying to get a data set for the whole United States. And what they did was they went to different states first, and they asked the states for information around these issues. And what they found was that every state had a different system for collecting information, if they collected data at all. And that's the important part, if they collected data at all. Now, granted, the ways of reporting and recording information were much different in the middle of the 20th century than they are now. There were no computers to help them with this in general, although computers, I guess, did exist. They weren't, in the school districts by any stretch of the imagination. They were at NASA, maybe. So they were doing all of this on paper. And one of the things that came out of Coleman's research was not only the important finding that we're going to discuss right now, but also the fact that there was an unstable system of data collection and storage around education in the United States, and that it was extremely diverse and varied from state to state. And so out of that came a lot of efforts to standardize the way that data was collected to, federal funding in particular started to be tied to requirements that states actually provide an annual collection of data around certain indicators. And then there's a whole other history of that out there. But anyway, there's my nerd level for today. So what James Coleman did was he found, through all this research, collecting all this data, he found something that wasn't necessarily expected. So what they expected to find was that kids who went to schools that were underfunded performed at a lower level. And kids that went to the schools that were well-funded performed at a higher level. And while this general rule is, I mean, he didn't reverse it or anything, but what he found was that a child's family background and the school's socioeconomic makeup were better predictors of academic success than just the school resources, the school funding. Now that's a really important consideration, and let me unpack that a little bit. Before I go to that slide, I want to unpack that a little bit. That meant that whether or not a kid came from a poor community or a low-income community, or whether that school was located in a low-income community, those were really the factors that had the strongest relationship with students' academic success. Let me give you an example of that. What they found was if you took, and by the way, this was another part of Johnson's agenda, right? Some of you may be familiar with school busing and sort of the phenomenon that school busing was in the 1970s in particular. I myself was bused all over town when I grew up in Oklahoma, so all over Oklahoma City as a result of these. But the idea was that if you took kids from particular neighborhoods and you bused them or you took them into different schools, especially better schools, or I should say better funded schools, which would at the time were going to be the white schools, then those kids would perform at higher levels. But what they found was, or what Coleman found was, that didn't necessarily play out. What happened was that if you took a low-income kid out of one neighborhood and put them in a highly funded school, their achievement didn't just jump. In fact, it either stayed the same, and in some cases it actually dropped. So in other words, they were not doing better academically because they'd moved into a better school per se. What the constant factor was, and what they found was really contributing to that student's academic success or not, had more to do with their home background and their home community than it did with the school they attended. Now that's a really, really important finding because it flips on its head a lot of the sort of de facto, sort of common sense ways of thinking about it. For example, many of you, and myself included, may have gone to a private school at some point during your K through 12 schooling, probably because your parents or your family or even the teachers at your public school said, this kid's smart, they should go on to a school that's better funded, that have teachers are better prepared, blah, blah, blah. And the idea would be if we went to those schools, then we would improve and it would make our academic careers that much more fruitful and we'd go to college and make $1 million. Well, the problem is that doesn't hold true. The data doesn't actually show that happens. What happens instead is that people who go to those schools have a different socioeconomic network, and so they're able to adjust and adapt and code switch and all the other things that happen as a result of that, so that even though their academic achievement may not rise or their actual learning may not rise, the way that they negotiate the social landscape changes. Okay, that was a tangent for me for a second. An unfortunate part of this, and I may be getting to a slide on this, so I probably am jumping the gun, was that a lot of people used Coleman's findings against the education system to say that, well, the Coleman report found that funding for schools doesn't matter, so we should just unfund all of the schools, because that's not really what makes a difference. And unfortunately, that did become a predominant argument for a long time, that because evidence showed that school funding didn't matter, then let's just not fund them at the same level. But it was a really important idea. Okay. There's a book by David Baker and Jerry Latondra that I'm going to quote a little bit here. If you guys are interested in this book, just shoot me an email. I'll send you the reference for it so you can go find it. But Baker and Latondra have done a lot of really interesting work on education in the United States and abroad. But looking at the way that education developed in the United States, they said, simplistic as it may sound, many policymakers at the federal level believed if we could just level the educational playing field, basic American values of achievement through merit and hard work would take over. So this idea that meritocracy would sort of save the day. If we gave everybody, regardless of their home background, their family's income level or socioeconomic status, if we put them all in the same type of schools, meaning that those schools have the same levels of funding, the same quality of teacher, the same opportunities to learn that are provided to the kids, then these American values of achievement through merit and hard work would level the playing field, would make it so that everybody was performing at a high level rather than this sort of high to low spectrum that we had. This idea of meritocracy, by the way, is one that runs throughout education in the United States, and you'll see it rear its head a lot. They go on to say that this belief in the power of education to drive social change is particularly salient in U.S. history. It also resonated with the hopes and beliefs of people around the world who saw a modern educational system as the golden path to economic prosperity and alleviation of persistent social problems. Now, this was the perspective that Johnson's administration had back when the Coleman report was commissioned. He really thought that if we can get kids into a modern, high-funded education system, that there will be this golden path that will alleviate all of the racial segregation issues of fallout that was happening, solve issues of economic disparity, alleviate a lot of persistent social problems. But the problem was that didn't really happen. And so what we find, as Baker and Latondra point out, is that we get an interesting paradox, namely that the considerable institutional strength and public support of mass schooling creates a situation where ever smaller differences among family backgrounds play a bigger role than differences among schools in producing variation in student achievement. This, in fact, was the Coleman report finding. Smaller differences among family backgrounds play a bigger role than differences among schools in producing variation in student achievement. Now, this doesn't mean that we want to have wide disparities in the funding of schools. Not at all. But if we're thinking about policy to practice, one of the things that we have to consider around education funding and the provision or the access to education that people from different backgrounds have is that access and opportunity sort of go hand in hand. The opportunity is provided by the funding. It's provided by the infrastructure. It's provided by the facilities and the personnel. The access, however, has a lot to do with where kids are going to end up going to schools. And so what access do they have to those levels of opportunity in their assigned or their local communities, assigned schools? So yeah, reaction to Coleman report, I told you some of that. And then even after many years of discussion and the discovery of the influence of school factors that are often tied to resources such as curricula and instructional quality, one still frequently hears a policymaker or educator state that schools do not matter as much as the family does in terms of achievement. And while I would not argue that that is unfair to say, in fact, I think that would be fair if a policymaker were to say that, the challenge for us then is to think about not only how do we level the playing field, so to speak, so that what vestiges of meritocracy are there can take over and those American values of hard work and fair play come in as much as they can, but that we also consider that these differences in family background can have huge effects themselves. And so part of our policy making agendas, our policy to practice agendas, have to consider how do we level the playing field at the family level, at the community level as well. So I'm just going to say this, and this is going to go against some of the stuff in here. If we want funding of education to really make a difference, you have to do more than equalize the infrastructure across schools, let's say in a district or in a community, or if we're talking about institutions, across institutions in the community. You have to equalize the conditions in which people live in order to make an actual impact. The two of those have to go together. You can't have one without the other. Now, it's easier, I'll just be honest, as a policymaker in particular, to level the playing field by equalizing resources for education than it is to equalize the playing field or the level the playing field in the home community. Because, I mean, we have all different levels of income. We have all different levels of economic resources, debt, expenses, all the culture, language, all the things that go into our socioeconomic background. So leveling the playing field in terms of socioeconomic background is a much harder task, but one that if we really want the leveling the playing field in terms of school funding to make a difference, we have to do one with the other. Okay, that's my little preaching for the day. So Baker and Lantandra go on to say that there's some misunderstanding that stems from blurring the considerable distinction between school effects and the effect of schooling. That's what I was just talking about. So schools do matter, and that's basically what they were saying in this last thing, the discovery of the influence of school factors. Schools matter, but there are also non-school factors that would be background characteristics of students and their families, linguistic and ethnic heritage, all those sorts of things that are just as important. So balancing the school and the non-school factors are going to be really important parts of this. Okay. So when we are talking about funding for education nowadays, we mostly talk about the funding and the things that we can provide through school that we then talk about in terms of school effects, which is the effect on academic achievement of going to one school versus another, usually with differences in resources. So we're going to have a conversation as policymakers or as consulting groups or whatever we are, not just about the levels of funding, but of the school effects that can be produced from, generated from, that follow from those resources. So, right, so school effects research examines if the varying levels of resources or policies or school climate and so forth from school to school explains achievement differences among students. And that's the main point of modest school quality effects that still holds in the United States. Now, there's different evidence about whether or not school funding really matters. And so there are other voices, especially among policymakers and among education researchers, that would say that there are some things that can't necessarily be bought, although you could make an argument for all of this. Teacher skills and experience is something, you can have very high quality teachers with high levels of skills and experience that are in low income communities and in underfunded schools. And the argument is they're the Jaime Escalantes of the world. These are the people that are really going to make an impact regardless of the other sort of funding factors that are out there. We could argue about principal effectiveness or the leadership effectiveness, or if you're in a for-profit realm, CEO effectiveness. The people at the helm and the way that they distribute resources and the way that they manage those resources can have a huge impact. If we shift all of our funding into something, basket weaving class, and we leave none of it for math and science, we're probably going to have kids that are not learning the basics very well and will underperform not only on measures of educational attainment, but won't be prepared adequately for whatever labor market opportunities would exist out there, unless there's a lot of basket weaving jobs that pop up. Class size can be a really important one. So we know that despite funding levels, if you jam 40 to 50 kids in a classroom, or if you try to expand for the sake of efficiency the number of customers that an individual or a group is meant to serve, then you find a huge drop in efficiency. As that teacher to pupil ratio rises, in other words, you have more and more kids per every one teacher, the achievement levels and the impact of education drops dramatically, even if funding overall for the institution is high. And then time on task has been argued to make a big difference. If half of the time that someone spends doing their job or going to school or whatever is on non-essential activities, like sitting at their desk twiddling their thumbs or perusing social media or whatever it might be that they're doing instead of the time on task, then you're going to find again that levels of resources don't matter as much. So most of this different evidence really shifts an emphasis to individual behaviors and individual actions, probably class size being the exception there. But if we talk about what's the impact of teachers, what's the impact of principals, what's the impact of time that individuals spend on certain activities, and this is usually students, I'll just call them studs, then you have an alternative reality or expectation about the effect that funding can have. So Marguerite Roza, who is chapter 3 of the Manna McGuinn book, also brings up some really interesting points that I wanted to highlight. And this is an excerpt out of page 52, where she talks about the finance system for education in particular is a complicated web of governance that has produced many intertwined but unrelated policies and practices, blah, blah, blah. She talks a lot about the importance of school boards in local districts in making funding decisions. And she points out that many, if not most, school board members are not, they're not accountants. They're not trained financial managers. They're, Joe's mom from down the street, and they're the business guy who has an aspiring political career, and so a school board is the first step or whatever. And so there's a lack of expertise that exists among the people, especially at the district level, that are often in charge of managing very large budgets, in charge of bringing in revenue, as well as determining how spending is going to play out in terms of managing those budgets. Anyway, we have to think about the level of expertise and the kind of people who are doing it. And that gets back to this emphasis on individuals, right? So when I talk about the different evidence, it's from the folks like Marguerite Roza. She's providing different evidence that focuses on individuals. But one of the things that she goes on to talk about is that there is a multi-layered system of revenues. And so again, this is something that isn't just relevant for education, but also, or the K-12 system, but also is true for many different types of organizations, because revenues come in generally from many different types of sources. And in particular, if you have a publicly oriented institution like education, then you're going to have different governmental layers that add funds slowly and gradually layered on based on different restrictions. And then you also have different stakeholder groups that are going to be able to permeate the decision-making structure within that public organization, as school boards do, or as parents can do, or as others in the community can do with public education. And that, she says, dictates the duties of staff inside the schools and results in a finance system that can't free up money. It won't let me draw down there. It can't free up money to try new things. And that's the emphasis on adaptation and innovation. So I thought this is relevant because when you think about how do you provide a response as a policymaker or as a policy researcher or someone who's informing policy, how do you provide a response to an organization or an entity that is going through, say, really important change, like perhaps a pandemic that has closed everything? And you have to think about the role that funding plays in that changing landscape. Well, if we have a system that has these multi-layered revenues that are in a lot of ways dominated by government sources, you have stakeholder groups that make conflicting demands on the education system. And then you're going to have a finance system that is tied by a lot of legal obligations due to where the money's coming from, and a lot of pressure from very high interest stakeholders in terms of how the money is spent. And that means that it's going to be difficult to be flexible with the way that that money is expended. Roza goes on to say, also on page 52, that there is, what I want to get with this is that I think she's talking about the, the pursuit of adaptation and innovation anticipates that money employees can be shifted in support of the adaptation. It assumes that as district circumstances change, as they often do, practices will be adapted to meet the new conditions. But we have state lawmakers that want some guarantees that taxpayer money is being put to good use. And that means that when we have these sorts of demands and these sorts of restrictions, states have generally two options. So one is that they can dictate how districts use the funds, or two, they can clearly articulate desired outcomes and then withdraw funds when districts use them poorly. So what Roza argues is that because option two is yields low returns for state funds, and there's a general unwillingness of states to do that, that states tend to stick with the former, which is, let's see if I can do a highlighter. They tend to dictate how districts use funds rather than have them use the funds and then just withdraw the money. So the argument is that we have a system that is largely inefficient because the people that are in charge of distributing funds at the state level, and those would be state folks that are managing federal funds that come into the state for education, as well as managing the way that local districts implement the funding that they're getting from the state level, that there is this I don't know, the big brother attitude to it, that they then have to be overseen by the state level. So that's a challenge for us, and that's a challenge for school districts. And I think Roza is right to point out that there is this dichotomy or this struggle between these two entities. So do school resources really matter or really influence student outcomes? Back on that question. And is funding manipulation the answer to school inequality? In other words, could we be leveling the playing field, as the Coleman report helped us talk about, and as politicians and policymakers, we're always striving for equity and equality. So if we manipulate the way the funding is distributed, if states in particular, according to Marguerite Roza, are the ones that are helping manipulate the way that school funding is distributed, can we level the playing field? Well, let's think about how that looks nationwide and at the state level and then at the local level. This is an old map. It was 2002 to 2003. I'm using this old one. I've actually used it for decades because this map, in terms of the colors, don't change. The national average is much higher now, but the concentration on high per pupil expenditure in the Northeast and relatively low per pupil expenditure in the Southwest is it's a universal trend. We don't see that change a lot. And what's interesting about that is thinking about why certain states in particular spend so much more on education than others do. A lot of it has to do with politics. So in some states, there is a political ideology, a political expectation that resources for implementing locally controlled entities like schools should not come from the state or federal level. They should come from the local level, or they should be the responsibility of families and parents. And so you'll see places like Utah, which has the lowest per pupil expenditure in the country year after year, decade after decade. And then you'll have at the other end of the spectrum, very odd case of Wyoming right there next to it, that is in the same category as Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania, and New Hampshire, and New Jersey or Maryland or one of the others over there. Right? Very high per pupil expenditure right next to each other. This isn't a product of geography, that's a product of politics. If we look at the percentage distribution of expenditures for elementary and secondary schools, you'll see, again, this is an old year, but the distributions don't change that much. Most of the funding goes towards instruction, which is predominantly salaries. I'm not going to lay it all on teachers, although they're the largest pot in the instruction bucket. But salaries are a huge part of the expenditures that are out there. The next level is support services, and the next level is non-instruction food service bookstores. One of the keys to looking at the differences in state levels of per pupil expenditure is the difference between support services and instruction. Where you see higher levels of expenditure, that usually means that support services has increased in terms of the percentage of the distribution of expenditures for school relative to instruction. I will point out that Pennsylvania, Ohio, and some others will have higher amounts or higher percentages of support services that are necessary to maintain their education system than other places like, and we'll pick on Utah here, or Oklahoma or Texas even. So the question is, who's paying? We know that year after year, the number one complaint of school administrators is the lack of funding and resources, but who are they complaining about and where is the money coming from? This is actually in one of your other readings that I think you've done for the funding unit, talking like I'm in a classroom in a high school again. You'll see that this is a distribution year by year up through 2013-14. This summary was put together by the Urban Institute from these sources, so make sure that you're aware of that. But what it shows is that back in the early part of the 20th century, almost all of the funding came from local sources for schools. And there was zero at the federal level and a smaller amount at the state level. As we've gone through time, and starting around the sort of 1990s and definitely in the 2000s, we've had this leveling off where the amount of funding from the local sources and the amount of funding from the state sources is relatively equal. A little jump in federal funding in the earlier part of the 21st century, but it's leveled back off. And you'll see that as a proportion of total K through 12 education revenue, federal funding is relatively low. In fact, it's very low. Now, one of the things to remember about that is even though that's a low percentage, percentage-wise, it's like 5%. I'm trying to go across here. 5 to 7% at the 2013-14 mark, which means that 95% of the revenue for education is coming from local and state sources, usually local and state taxes. This 5% is still going to be very large. Let's say that your total budget for your school district, if you're in a large school district, maybe it's $1 billion. 5% of $1 billion, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. You're not just going to wave goodbye to that. And even if your revenue for your district, let's say it's $1,000, you're really small. You've got like 3 students and 1 employee who works for free. 5% of that is still going to be a whack, right? Because you have to consider what it is you're spending the money on. And if you take away 5% of that still makes an impact. And the larger your total budget, the larger the 5% becomes. So 5% can be thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so no one wants to lose that. We also, again, can think again, about what the percentage of the expenditures goes to salaries, benefits, purchase services, supplies. I've already talked about the fact that most of the expenditures go to salaries, although that has slightly dropped over time, but still the lion's share goes to salaries. So personnel and people are still the most important investment or expenditure that education systems have. And by the way, again, this accounts for organizations other than just educational systems. Now, if we think about the federal financing of public schools, first, there's a long history of funding for public schools, which we won't go through the history of all this, but land grants, vocational acts, relief acts, war acts, compensatory acts have all been part of federal financing for public schools. They often, this kind of funding often is focused on a particular response to a crisis or a particular initiative to get things going. It is rarely perpetual. Sometimes it's renewable, but rarely perpetual, meaning that it is for a specific purpose and then it stops. It might be a big influence of money one year and then zero the next year, forever after that. There has been a shift, and we've actually just seen some news about this recently, which is interesting. So you'll, if you're watching this, at a later time, you'll know that when I was talking to you right now. There just was an announcement and then a retraction from Trump and DeVos that schools might have federal funds withheld if they don't open up in the fall, in spite of the coronavirus restrictions that might be in place and the dangers that might involve. But it's a great example of how federal funding has sort of some components to it, categorical grants, block grants, and now DeVos in particular is a big fan of privatization, and so shifting the idea to privatization rather than withholding of money. Let's talk about categorical grants first of all. So categorical grants often are monies that are set aside for specific services. So to ensure that there is adequate educational funding for people from a particular minority group, or to influence women's STEM education, or to provide a head start for low-income or underserved communities. Those are the kinds of things that categorical grants go towards. There's a category, there's funding that's specific for that. There's somebody who's actually working on making sure that the money only goes for those purposes and is spent in an appropriate way. There's a lot more oversight among categorical grants than there is for any other kind of grant. During the George W. Bush and Dick Cheney era, block grants became even more important. And in fact, this was part of the No Child Left Behind sort of era, where a shift went, a lot of categorical grants were unfunded and block grants were then funded. Block grants are undesignated funds, or largely undesignated funds, that would be shifted from the federal government to the state for education. But block grants come with much fewer restrictions, or many fewer restrictions, a lot less restrictions, a lot fewer restrictions, because block grants can be spent at the discretion of the state or the local community, meaning that categorical grants probably provided more money, and block grants absolutely provided less money than a categorical grant would provide. But categorical grants come with funding, spending restrictions, whereas block grants were much more left at the discretion of the state and local education agencies. Now, one of the huge shifts in federal aid or federal policy towards education over the years, and it has been especially true with Betsy DeVos as the Secretary of Education, is an emphasis on the privatization of education, meaning that education can be provided in a more of a market realm. And the argument is that publicly funded education, publicly governed education is not competitive because it has people being assigned or dedicated to particular communities, rather than being able to negotiate among those different schools and take the funding for their education to whichever school they prefer. Now, I'm sitting in Lubbock, Texas, that has a very open transfer policy, so it's probably not the best place to make an argument like this, or provide an example for something like this. But in general, when we talk about privatization, we're simply talking about shifting government-funded education to privately funded or privately run, managed education. Still could be government funded. So one of the things that was walked back in the recent news when Trump and DeVos initially said that federal money could be withheld from schools that didn't open in the fall due to COVID-19 concerns, that was walked back, and now Betsy DeVos has been talking about how, well, what they really meant to say was that parents should have a choice of where they send their kids. So it's a nice deflection. It's a policy spin to say, all right, well, we didn't really mean we were going to withhold funding. But a way that we could withhold funding is if we gave parents the choice of where they want to send their schools and if they or send their kids, and if they choose to send their kids to a school that's open or a different school that might still be online, then they have the right to do so. Very important policy considerations behind this, and absolutely an issue of do we provide local control, or how much power over this does the federal government relinquish. State aid models are where most of I guess, interesting stuff about education funding comes from when we think about how do states actually fund education, because as you know, states have the responsibility for education in the United States. The federal government does not have a constitutional responsibility for education, states do. There are several different plans. Some of those are in the report that you're reading from the Urban Institute. I'm going to give you a little more information about this here. You're also reading about HB3 from Texas. It's a really interesting update to the foundation plan. So anyway, there are four that I think you should be aware of, largely speaking. One is a flat grant model. It's really the oldest and most unequal method. And the idea is that everybody, every school would get, or every district would get the same amount of money. So every district gets $100,000 or $500,000 or whatever it is, depending on the size and wealth of the state. Or every district gets $1 billion. We'll just go crazy. It means that you could have a district or a community that has huge facilities and infrastructure issues that have to be addressed, that has a highly mobile, low-income population, meaning that all of the social services have to be implemented. And it's really hard to retain teachers for whatever reason, although I've given you some. And so the only way to recruit teachers to that area is to have more money to recruit them with. But in a flat grant model, a district or a community that was experiencing all those challenges that I just mentioned would get the same amount of money as the wealthiest, most well-heeled, so to speak, community that's out there, which probably doesn't need all the money. A foundation plan, just go to the next one, is a minimum cost per student. It's the most common plan across all states. The idea is that there is a minimum amount of money that will be provided per pupil. Rather than per district, it's per pupil. So that means as opposed to a flat grant model where you could give a very small district the same amount of money as a very large district, in the foundation plan, a small district will get a small amount of money compared to a larger district, which would get a larger amount of money because they have more people in them. A power equalizing plan would do exactly what it says. It would provide funding in an inverse ratio to wealth. So instead of per student doing a count of bodies that are in that district, it would be by average income level or the overall economy in the district. So that means that poor communities would receive more money from the state and rich communities would receive less money from the state, regardless of the number of students that they have in them. And then finally, a weighted student plan, where students are weighted by characteristics like being disabled or disadvantaged or in special programs or vocational and bilingual, something like that, so that there would be more funding that was provided for communities that had more demonstrated needs for resources. Those are, when you weight like that, you could actually have a very wealthy district that also had a lot of disabled or special programs going on in it. And so those kinds of communities would need more funding in order to run all those programs. So this is a very brief description of some of the different state aid models. Like I said before, your Urban Institute reading is going to provide a little more description of some of the other state aid models. You could also find a Foundations of Education textbook if you're dying to learn more about this stuff and find information about it. We also know that at least half of the money, or about half of the money that goes towards education is from local financing, which is often based on property taxes. You can think about all the different ways that property tax is assessed. I'm not going to go into that right now. There is also the opportunity for local communities to levy other taxes and fees. There are often bond measures. There are ways that you can tax vices. There are other things that local communities can do other than property tax to bring in revenue for education, although property tax still remains the predominant method in most of the United States. Roza in Manna McGuinn on page 42 made a really important point that district expenditures are not coded by subject matter in most districts in the United States, meaning that most districts don't really know how much money they spend on particular investments. What they know more is about how much they spend for staff. So she makes the argument that in most of the United States, districts allocate funds based on staff, not in terms of how much money is going towards different actual programs or parts of instruction or pedagogy. So existing school district financial systems make it extremely difficult to extract the per student costs of basic district services. Now that's a really important understanding. And again, you're going to find variation. There are going to be some districts that will do this well. So I don't want you to think that this is a blanket truth. However, it's probably a pretty good stereotype for districts across the United States. And the argument there is that without that information, leaders can't know how their investments compare across key priorities. They simply know how much they're spending for different types of staff, because staff is tracked more specifically. And then on page 43, Roza provides this, I think, really helpful table that looks at different district spending patterns, pointing out the objectives in those districts tend to not align with the actual school spending. So, for example, I'll just pick the one in the middle here. Often an objective for student outcomes is to get students up to speed in core subjects, make sure that reading, writing, arithmetic, all the core subjects are where they're performing at the highest level. But money tends to be spent at a higher level for elective courses. So for home ec and for art and for athletic programs and other sorts of things that would not be core subjects. That's a really important observation. And although I don't agree with everything that Roza says in her chapter, these are spot on comparisons. So this dichotomy, or this irony really, of spending that happens at the local level and not being able to track it nor being able to really align it means that there's a lot of messiness when it comes to actual, not just where the money comes from, but where the money goes. And it's one of the reasons why she argues, I'm not going to go all the way back to it, but why she argues that states tend to opt for the more prescribed, managed plan of distributing money, where they say, you're going to spend it on this, rather than the block grant approach that we've seen at times from the federal level that says, here's a whole bunch of money, go use it, and you decide where. As we sort of finish this up, I want to point out that there's a lot of disparity in local school resources. In urban communities, there's something called municipal overburden that exists, meaning that there are a lot more expenses in urban areas when there are, this picture is an example, when there are facilities or other infrastructure elements that are older, and so they require more repair or they require replacement or things like that. We also find that in different parts of cities, there are different tax bases. And so in certain parts of those communities, especially low income parts, the tax revenue that is available for those districts that cover those parts of the city are going to be lower. You'll find that savvy school boards and superintendents will spend a lot of time lobbying to have larger industries move into their districts. So they become sort of developers of their community, because with larger industry comes a larger tax base. So they're able to get more money as a result of having those industries in their communities. But of course, the irony is when you have a high industry community, you usually don't have high income people living there. Educational overburden means that along with some of that municipal overburden, you'll find that there are pockets of the community that have been undereducated or have, for whatever reason, a lot of it has to do with their socioeconomic backgrounds, not been able to take advantage of all the educational opportunities and resources available to them. And so as they go through the educational system, they need more and more special services in order to bring them up to speed or to level the playing field, as we've talked about over and over again. And this leads to a cycle of financial strain. So when you have municipal and educational overburden occurring, you find that there is really no way out, that it tends to repeat itself. And it's not just a cycle, it's sort of a downward spiral. Okay. Some trends just to be aware of, and then I think we're done. privatization. There is an increasing resistance among taxpayers, especially older taxpayers, to provide additional funds in their local taxes for education. A lot of that has to do with their attitude that they don't have kids anymore, and so why is that of concern to them? We also see that there's resistance to any sort of taxing that goes on, especially in more conservative areas of our country. That's not to say that conservative communities don't care about education, but the way that the funding is collected is often a source of contention. We have also a lot more emphasis on the accountability movement, meaning that we see more and more tying of distribution of resources to measures of outcome or success from educational systems. The problem is there's not a very direct measure that connects funding to student learning outcomes. We see more and more, and this is also because of privatization, more and more of the push to take state and federal public monies and apply them towards private institutions. So we see that money for education tends to be shifting out of the public education system and into privatized resources. That is also very much a policy agenda, is driven largely by expectations that do lean in a political direction that look more at the importance of competition and the opportunities to provide values or other sorts of education that might not be as allowable in a government-sponsored education system. And then we see streamlining of schools' budgets, meaning that there are cuts that are going to be made and are being made, and we see those right now with COVID-19, especially the athletics at the moment. We see that there are cuts made to schools' budgets that might eliminate certain unnecessary or non-core elements of those budgets or those funding structures. And so it means that the types of innovation and adaptation that schools can make is limited because the budgets become more and more narrowly focused on core outcomes, like reading, math, writing, those sorts of things, which aren't bad things. It's just, what do you have the money available to do? Okay, we've covered a lot, more than you probably wanted. But it was, I think, important for us to talk about funding broadly speaking. Now, the question for you is to think about, how does policy follow on this, or how does policy contribute to this? Where's policy in the mix? And thinking about that policy spectrum from beginning to end, where policies often have a political beginning, but they have a very practical implementation, functional implementation. And how do we work with stakeholders along the whole spectrum, from the politics of it to the functional implementation, and make sure that they are involved, engaged, they have ownership, and they become champions of those policies as we move forward. Well, one way is to make sure that the needs and the expectations for those stakeholders at each of those levels of the policy process are being met. And so as you're thinking about how to interpret and how to apply all of this financial information about education and funding, also think about those stakeholder and policy situations as well. Okay, and good talking to you.